My talk today is actually about 3 pieces that I've written over the last 7 years, and then new work in progress. And the 3 pieces, they sort of comprise different approaches to using interactive systems, and also this kind of topic of the talk you see up there, but this idea of resistance and obstinate systems. The 3 pieces, four including the one that I'm working on, but the 3 that actually are kind of complete are this piece for dance, Zynoholiform, this piece called Vis-a-Vis, which I call an interactive monodrama. It's a little bit hard to describe it actually, but that's the best way I've come up to describe it. And then a piece for a custom controller that I built, a glove controller called Collide, and that actually represents one example of a lot of the work I do performing with controllers and things. And then this last project that I've been working on, which is a series of dramatic etudes called Studies in Movement, and it's definitely in progress. So I had particular reasons for calling this last project Studies in Movement, and what I want to explore today with you is actually represents a study of movement in a more general way. It's a concept that's informed my own work with music, gesture, and interactive programming. And I'm talking about this idea of resistance and an intentional obstinate behavior that I've sort of come to program into my systems that I make for these pieces. And it's something that's evolved through these different projects. And I hope by taking you through these pieces, I'll kind of show you how this notion of resistance and obstinate behavior has informed these projects and also the work in progress. So I actually thought I would start by just thinking about resistance. I know it's been something that people have talked about for sure. We could start by just thinking about the definitions of resistance, something that fends off or offset actions, effects, or the force of something. We could, the notion of something that opposes motion seems particularly apt for interactive performance pieces. And Joel Ryan and others have linked resistance to a notion of virtuosity and the effort and expression that's tied to that. All things that are necessary for musical expression, which is a very hard thing to define, actually. I myself look at resistance as a quality of the physical interface as well as a quality of the entire interactive system. So I'm thinking about the way the system behaves and the fact that it might cooperate or not cooperate with you. In this sense, actually, I was really pleased to discover Aidan Evans' 2005 book, Music Machine Experience, which I'm sure a lot of you know. In it, he makes an interesting case for the notion of resistance in musical instrument design. So the interface must push back, make itself felt, get in the way, provoke or problematize the experience of the user. The instrument presents a leading edge of indeterminacy. Its resistance is its creative potential. So the idea of the interface pushing back, the idea of indeterminacy, especially in my case, and the idea of problematizing the experience of the user or performer is a better way to put it, and not just users of systems. These are all key components of the kind of work that I'll be showing you. So the first piece I want to show you as an example, and this is kind of one of the ones where I sort of started to explore these ideas, is a piece for interactive dance. It's a piece called Zynoholiform. It was created in collaboration with Palindrome Intermediate Performance Group. And so I should mention Robert Wexler is a choreographer, and Frieder Weiss is the engineer who designed the video tracking system. The basic schematic of the system looks something like this, where you have a couple computers, and there's some cameras, of course. The icon was running on a PC, and it's actually sending data via OSC over to this Macintosh, which is doing the audio. And so the idea that there are multiple angles that are viewed from of the dancers, and that there's sort of the mapping of dance gesture to synthesis is happening, kind of translating this data from the video tracking. Some of the data analysis that I ended up doing and things that the system could actually track are these things, like changes in the presence of a body part at a given position in space, the amount of movement occurring within a defined area, the global position of an individual body in the horizontal or vertical space, the kind of the center of gravity, the degree of right-left symmetry in the body, which is a very interesting parameter, degree of expansion or contraction in the overall body profile, and the relative proximity of multiple dancers. And this is sort of just giving you an idea of what that might look like to the video tracking system is kind of division into zones. And you'll see this in an example I'll be playing you, that this is sort of one particular camera's view of the space and the way it was being sort of broken up into kind of areas that were analyzed. Also, this idea of kind of tracking the center of gravity and the overall body profile as kind of gives you an idea what that might be like. So one of my goals for this project, and in working with Robert and Frieder, it was a very collaborative project, and I have to say it was one of the most collaborative things I've been involved in, because we literally were in the space all at the same time, creating the piece, choreographing Frieder's recompiling icon. Well, he actually had a tendency to do that even during performances. So, I mean, he was completely nuts, but he was amazing. So it was that kind of cycle of development where it's actually very atomistic, and things were tried out, developed, and it was a very rewarding experience. But my goal for kind of working on this project was to create a sense that there was something that was pushing back against the dancers. And of course, since it's this kind of non-contact interface with video tracking, you're not going to have any kind of haptic feedback like that. So there was this, like, how could you make the system kind of feel like it was resisting and pushing back? What I ended up going with is this idea that that the system itself actually would become a resistant or obstinate entity. And that, if you think about the kind of the data that can be coming from the video tracking over here, and then there's kind of the sound engine on the right over there, and in between is this kind of place where the mapping and connections are made. Well, one of the things I kind of started working with was this idea that the connections themselves are broken or remade, and that the mapping engine has a sort of algorithmic quality to it where things are connected or disconnected, and this kind of watcher is deciding whether to make or break these connections in the mapping. And so that the system has these kind of controllable elements that can, in a sense, go out of control. And what happens is that the connections are broken, and then a kind of a algorithmic gesture generator will, in a sense, take over and take the spot of the real dancer and sort of be controlling the system. And this can happen for various parameters, and one of the ways I kind of ended up building it was that the dancer then could regain control of the system by doing certain kinds of gestures of certain velocity and sense. So he could actually, in a sense, wrest control of the system back to himself. And there was this sort of tug-of-war a little bit with the dancer and the system. And it actually, of course, it leads to a lot more indeterminacy, in a sense, in the performance. But it also led to a way where the dancer actually learned the system and, in a sense, really knew the kind of nooks and crannies of this thing and how he could kind of bring it back. And so he, at least as a test case, has said that he's felt really that it was something that he could really play with, in a sense. So I'll give you a little example here. It's actually a piece for two dancers. This will just be an excerpt from the solo by Robert, the excerpt towards the beginning of the piece. Oh, let's see, it's right. I have to go back to mirroring. Actually, I wonder, could we lower the lights a little bit or something? It's a little bit, or at least this row up here, maybe. Yeah, okay, great, that's better. So the next project after this actually was directly tied to this, although it seems completely a different kind of project. And it's this monodrama piece I was talking about called Vis-a-Vis. The thing is that actually this dance piece was inspired by a short little kind of a cell of a bit of text from Rilke, which is the xynoholoform, which comes out of this kind of rumination on the nature of faces from this, the notebooks of Malta Lourdes Briga. And there's this kind of well-known passage in there in prose where he talks about the nature of faces, and this little thing, xynoholoform, was from that. And so after doing this dance piece, I thought, well, this is such an amazing text, so I should actually do something with it. And that actually led to this next project, Vis-a-Vis. So Vis-a-Vis, the resistance actually is similar, coming from a system standpoint, although it's actually very different because you're not actually doing sort of a gesture capture, of course. It's all kind of indirect acquisition from the voice of the singer. So it has a sort of another layer of mediation, which is interesting. And so the singer in this case is Catherine, and my wife, actually, Catherine Bergeron. And so we've done the piece quite a lot. And again, I have a real interesting kind of a set of sort of test case experiences of talking to her about her experience performing this and how it's changed over the time. In this case, the idea of the watcher in the dance piece is sort of replaced by a listener, of course, which is kind of listening to the indirect acquisition from the voice and kind of changing mappings and settings of the system as the piece goes on. And here the gestural data is not derived from the video, tracking the human body, but it's actually this other kind of embedded thing of the voice. And it becomes a very kind of personal connection between the performer, Catherine in this case, and the system. And she's talked a lot about how it feels like this kind of entity that she's working with. And the same kind of thing happens where there's sort of alterations of the system as the piece progresses. This is a kind of just a schematic of it. There are a couple computers, and there's a video thing which actually was originally done in this software called Anodyne, which is, I redid it for Jitter now, but because the company went out of business to do that, of course. But the compositional process on this really relied on the system resisting predictable results. So here the system decides to listen or not to listen. And so as the performance is happening, Catherine has this the potential that the system can actually sort of break away from her and start kind of generating material on its own. And she has the ability through certain things like kind of changes in rates of change in amplitude and things like that, or kind of spectral changes. She can also, similar to the dance piece, kind of bring control back to herself if she wants to. So I'll play you a short example of this. And I should actually explain the context. This is actually the end of about a 30-minute piece. So it's kind of a slice of something that's, you have to kind of imagine this dramatic build-up to this point, which you're not going to get seeing a short example. But what you'll see actually, or hear at a certain point, is that everything stops, and she says this kind of phrase, bare wounded head, which is the crux of the Rilke text. He talks about walking through the streets of Paris, and he comes across this woman. He surprises her, and he's startled, and she's startled, and she has her face in her hands, and she pulls her face out of her hands so quickly that he says, like, her face is left in her hands. And then he says he was much more afraid of the bare wounded head than of this face. And it's this incredible image. And so this is a point where you're seeing is actually that point where she says bare wounded head, and it's kind of the crux of the piece, and it kind of turns a corner, and you'll see most of the end after that. And actually the system has a very different response at this spot, and so I'd have to play you like 5 or so examples for you to kind of compare them, but this particular time the system basically decided to be fairly silent, and it was really interesting because it becomes a very kind of, the poignancy is really different, I think, kind of heightened because of the system basically said, well, I'm not going to do anything, in a way, for at least a while, and then she kind of brings it back. So I'll play you a little bit of that.
Afraid of that big wounded head. Habe ich es schon gesagt?
So it's almost the ending there. All right. So as you know, as I mentioned at the beginning, that I'm playing tonight with this trio Gray Code. I actually do a lot of my own performance. So far I've shown you other people performing with these systems and doing these pieces. I do a lot of my own performance with horns, with kind of extended electronics on the horns and things like that, and also with controllers that I've built. One of the pieces that I've done using this glove controller I built actually while I was at IRCOM is a piece called Collide. And this was actually where I kind of even became a little bit more intentional about this, or more kind of premeditated, I suppose. Because before I sat down to do the piece, I was thinking to myself, well, I want to make a piece that actually needs a particular kind of energy to happen. And so like I was thinking about the kinds of gestures that I would want to make in order to make this piece. I had no idea what the sounds would be, actually, but I knew I wanted to make a certain kind of gesture. And I had in mind actually a sort of difficult, almost overwhelming atmosphere that would require a lot of physical activity to keep it going. It's sort of like the reservoir of energy that need to be continually filled up, in a sense. Giving rise to kind of a chain of endless collisions, it was the idea. So this is the more kind of schematics of stuff like that. It's a controller, and there's a couple computers, and there's more interactive video and things like that. The hardware actually seems kind of old now, because this is stuff that I built a while ago. Now, like tonight, I'm using kind of more, wireless stuff and all this kind of things that I've built now, but this is kind of earlier version of this kind of stuff. The kind of setup on stage is like this, with a data glove, an infrared controller, and some sensors and converters and stuff like that. The idea really was actually that I wanted to make something where I had to be kind of violent to make the piece happen. And it's interesting because I know when I perform the piece, a lot of times people are sort of taken aback, like, because it's not the kind of thing you normally see at a concert, like especially electroacoustic concerts. I did the piece at a conference in San Diego, and people were like a little bit like scared in a way, I think, because it actually it gets very, very intense, and I'm, in a sense, thrashing around for 10 minutes. I mean, it has a different kind of energy curves. It's not completely like that, but it's really interesting. It's the closest I've come actually to feeling like I used to feel when I played electric guitar in a band. Like that, you've got that kind of thing that's happening, and you feel like you have to do something to make something happen. So and that's the way it feels to me, at least, to performing it. I'll play you a short excerpt of that. From the beginning. this next section. So actually, in this case, the system is really probably the most difficult to use of the things that I've built, and it's actually was quite hard to learn to use it because there are a lot of actually multiple mappings of sensors that have to happen in a certain way for anything to happen, and so it was built to require this kind of very awkward and kind of really exaggerated kind of gesture. And again, I think because it's really difficult to use, I found it pretty interesting to try to learn how to use it. At first, it was actually really hard, and I have to say that the first performance was a kind of a failure, really, because I didn't even know how to basically play the thing. It was like, wow, okay, I built this, and it took me a couple of years to really learn how to play the piece. It actually still surprises me now and then when I do it, that there are certain kind of things that I find in it that I was sort of surprised about. But all of this kind of work that I've showed you so far kind of is kind of leading, and I want to sort of talk about this work in progress that is interesting because the resistance is not just a kind of a technical concern or kind of thing that I was sort of thinking about. It's the material concept of the piece itself. The piece I'm talking about is actually all about gesture and about sort of the history of the study of gesture. And there's this piece called Studies of Movement, which actually will be a set of pieces, sort of these dramatic etudes. The project began conceptually as an extension of Vis-a-Vis, really, in the desire to kind of work dramatically with sound and image. But I wasn't, so much inspired by text this time, but more about kind of the work of a particular person, and just kind of fascinated by the work of Etienne Jules Mouret and the sort of the history and his work in kind of understanding gesture. So a few things about Mouret, if you don't know about him, is kind of an amazing guy. Amongst all these things, he's a doctor physiologist. He was sort of first to study the physiology of movement and gesture, invented these first gestural sensor systems that were run pneumatically with rubber tubing and things, invented something he called chronophotography, which was kind of sort of simultaneous with Muybridge and not, and they influenced each other, but his work really is seen by some as a precursor to cinema. And one of his many publications is his culminating work, Le Mouvement, which is kind of a synopsis of a lot of his work. And I was amazed at first when I saw this work, and I'm interested in gadgets. I like to build things, and when I sort of saw the plethora of things that this guy worked on, it was incredible. So this is an example of this pneumatic sensor system that he designed. And so there's a series of rubber tubes, and it works on this using this thing that came to be called the tambour de Mouret, which was it's a small drum that has rubber on each side, and tubing will go into one side, and then variations in air pressure through the tubing make the other membrane flex. And so what you could do is attach a stylus to that other membrane, and then you can actually make something vary here, and then you actually get like an inscription there by varying the air pressure. And that's what you see there is this rubber tubing, and actually the guy is carrying a graphical tracing machine, which is there's a rotating cylinder that has been blackened probably with smoke, and it's actually then kind of scratching this line of the sensor data in the rotating cylinder. So I don't know, stuff like that was just kind of amazing. And he wasn't content just to put it on humans. So he was very interested in flight and birds. And a lot of people do credit him with influencing the early development of aviation. And of course, he was looking at birds, which was not ultimately the way to do it. But there were things that he did actually understand about the way lift works over a wing and things like that were important. I really particularly like this thing here, though, the sensor shoes, because you see here, actually, there's kind of this rings of pneumatic tubing that would go up to a tambour de Mouret, and then it would actually be inscribed on the rotating cylinder there. You could actually get the graphical trace. That actually just amazed me because you think, well, things don't change, really, do they? Because here he's doing this, and 100 years later or so, we have another sensor shoe. It's a little more sophisticated, but that the idea of sort of trying to get those kinds of gestures, he was thinking about that. And he originally started by this sort of direct acquisition with sensors and tubing and things like that. He did actually end up moving into photography, and that's quite fascinating. He developed this thing he called the fusil photographique, which, let me get out of the way. It was this gun-shaped thing. It's only gun-shaped in order to be able to point it inside a bird with it. It has a rotating glass plate in there, and then you could take actually 12 rapid succession images of a bird. And so this is one way he was sort of trying to study bird flight. And it actually had like a changeable magazine there. You could actually just move that kind of magazine and put another plate on out in the field. This is what one of the plates actually looks like. So the kind of mechanical invention is quite amazing. So I was kind of fascinated just from that standpoint, like the invention of this. But actually, ultimately, what really kind of caught my attention was the kind of the aesthetic beauty of some of the byproducts of his research, and people have written about this quite a lot. For example, images like this, where just visually very striking. And can you guys tell what that is? I think someone up here has it. Does anyone have an idea what it is? Yeah, I think Bennett's got it. It is actually, in a sense, a motion capture of. It's actually this guy with this suit on, and he's jumping off this chair. So you're able to see the trajectory of the various points of the body as this guy jumps off the chair with this kind of multiple exposure. And so actually what Murray did is he would take these photographs and then actually trace them. He wasn't that interested in the photograph in a sense. He actually traced it on the paper and he was doing analysis that way. So this was just kind of a step along the way. But the photographs are quite amazing. And the idea that that he sort of came up with this, it did have quite an influence on contemporary artists at the time, and so there's Duchamp's Nudes Descending a Staircase, and there's Murray's image, and you could even see reference to the these kind of things right in here. And it's known actually that Duchamp did actually know Murray's work. In fact, because Duchamp's brother worked for an assistant of Murray in one of the labs, so this stuff was actually out there. And this is all kind of happening at that time in many different ways. But the idea of sort of like kind of imposing simultaneity like that is pretty amazing. Also, here's a pair of another beautiful examples. This is actually a soldier walking and then running. And so a similar kind of suit, although you can see it has these kind of lines on it. And he actually, like many contemporary research, it was funded by the military. And so he actually had money from the French military to sort of come up with a way to help train soldiers because they'd lost the Franco-Prussian War, and there's this whole thing about this, the French soldiers were not fit enough, and so how could they? And this actually was part of the whole physical education movement that comes up out of this too. So these are the kinds of things that inspire me, this analysis of gesture through image, and so Murray has become the subject matter of this project, both in terms of his techniques of analysis and the kinds of imagery that emerge from them. As a result, this project actually is first and foremost a visual piece, and so I've done a lot of work on the imagery first, and so I'll be showing you some things that are sort of, in fact, various things, one of them doesn't even have sound yet, but it's just kind of a sketch of some stuff. And this piece will be a series of etudes. Some of them will be actually pure video concrete pieces in a sense. And then there will be actually works for chamber ensemble and electronics and some for dance and electronics. And it's kind of a set of different kinds of pieces. And like I said, it's very much in progress. I just have a few things I'm working on, and I'll be working with a dancer hopefully this next year. So the first example I'd like to show you uses a set of processes that are analogous to the ones seen in some of these Murray images. Here, actually, it's a high-speed videography of a violinist. So I kind of started with a violinist, and I was doing this high-speed video, kind of trying to look into the gestures of violin playing and kind of see what do you see in there. visually, in addition, of course, to kind of trying to capture it via various sensor systems. And so here, what you'll see is a short video that's kind of trying to do a similar kind of thing like the Murray images do, where it's sort of trying to turn the image into kind of a visual sculpture in a way. So this is one of the kind of sketches. So that I showed you started by showing you some of the kind of more quirky images of Murray. Some of them you've probably seen, like more familiar ones are images like this. And this is actually Murray's assistant, Dimini, and walking in this white suit with this multiple exposure. Another approach to looking at bird flight, this time much more sophisticated than the fuseau photographique. You can see that it's even over a span of 10 or 15 years, it's developing quite a lot. And then actually what is interesting is this idea that he had this desire to kind of try to translate that into this 3D sculpture. So there was this idea, I mean, he actually talks about this as analysis and resynthesis, like to try, can you synthesize this thing? And so he actually, even in the study of bird flight, he was building small flying models to see, did this actually make sense and did it work? And so he was, this is some of his approaches to this. I was really fascinated that kind of almost cubist aspect of this thing. And so this next example, in a way, takes off from that approach. And it's somewhat analogous in it's reanimating this image, again, of this violinist. But instead of turning it into sculpture, of course, it's kind of making a polyphonic texture out of this one image. So this is the chronophotograph that I made, that I started with. And then what you'll see is actually this, the video is actually being kind of animated by the real-time violinist, so that the video is kind of being constructed from violin playing. It's a very short little example, though. Let's see. So again, I should, kind of remind you that this actually is a piece for real-time performance. Showing you videos makes it look like a video piece in a sense, but it actually does have performers, and this is sort of interactive system built around this. And there'll be a kind of a chamber ensemble, other things included. But this brings me to a point that's kind of central to this project, that this project is really kind of looking at the centrality of the instrument and the player in the interactive work. So it's really about the player and the kind of the gesture, trying to make the gesture kind of really visible. And so looking more into Murray's work, I was kind of surprised when I came across some of this stuff that this is actually from Georges Deminy's Mécanisme et Éducation des Mouvements, which is a book that he brought out just shortly after Murray died. He was Murray's assistant, and he kind of follows on in he actually had done a lot of the work actually at the Station Physiologique that Murray ran, but he continues and he gets very involved in the physical education movement. And part of this large book, which includes everything from gymnastics and everything, has a bit about violin playing. It was really fascinating to kind of see this. He's talking about movement of the bow and actually how the kind of angle of the wrists can mitigate against the kind of audible change, of the bow and things like that. This is from a different part of the book where just talking about muscle flexion and things like that. And you actually can see there's another tambour de Murray being used, actually two of them being used for the pneumatic system that would actually translate that data to something that would be inscribing it like you see below. So actually, pardon me? Sorry, what?
We should get some of
Oh, yeah, right. We should. Yeah, well, they don't need batteries or anything, at least. So, but yeah, actually, what was amazing to me though was to see this and actually think back at when I was at IRCAM and when I was working with Marcelo and other people there, and that we had been really interested in looking at violin playing. And I dug this up out of the archives, this image where we had sort of done a violin analysis, and this, and it's funny to think about these ideas. But this is audio kind of synchronized with 4 layers of gestural data from the violinist. There was kind of pressure against the body, and there was kind of angle of the arm and angle of the bow and pressure on the bow and things like that. But looking at it now, actually way removed from the initial kind of let's get some data from this violinist, looking at it now, what I see in that data is, I see it a little bit differently. The image shows a kind of representation of the resistance of the instrument. In fact, it's kind of a polyphony of resistance. You see the violin body, you see finger against bow, against the resistance of the bow. So the instrument itself is this kind of locus of resistance, and it's sort of there. In addition to information about it, it's also that it is this kind of structure in a sense. So this next example I'd like to show you actually is a kind of a process looking at the same kind of gestures in the Demini. It's really kind of more kind of almost an analysis because there's no sound. And what you'll see here is actually the violin gestures are overlaid on a grid, and what happens in the video process is that the faster moving parts of the image fracture and kind of break into pieces, and the more stationary parts kind of remain, they cohere. And I think you'll get it. And there's no sound to this. And what's interesting is you actually can see the thing that Dimini was talking about, and the different kind of rates of movement of the bowing gesture are kind of become clear based on that kind of fracturing or coherence of the image. So some of this project also has a kind of an analytical side to it as well. What I've shown you so far is kind of one of hundreds of different kind of video processes and things I've written for this piece. And like I said, it kind of has started as this visual project, which is something I've gotten quite involved in recently. And tonight, actually, in the concert, there's a video piece that's just pure video and sound. But just the idea of kind of like looking at the gesture in many different ways, and from video and also via sensor systems. But going back to some of the earlier images I talked about, because I want to kind of move to one of my last examples, the idea of actually sort of tracing the gesture, you can see on that kind of vertical cylinder there that this gestures are being inscribed, and so there's this drawing or sense, and this kind of graphology that the gesture actually has this inscription, and this here is tracing from the bird sensor system there. And what Murray was looking at actually was the motion of the wing, and he was trying to kind of prove, did the wings kind of move forward and down like this? Do they oscillate like that? Or did they actually move kind of backwards and down like this, like rowing a boat? And there was this big controversy at the time, like which way did they go? And he actually was able to prove that they actually went forward and down like that. And that's what this is showing. So the last example I'm going to show actually sort of takes this idea of the trace of the gesture kind of literally and kind of uses it as an image. It uses kind of a sensor system. It's not video kind of analysis. It uses a new sensor system that I built, which is far updated from the kind of glove control thing I said, but here's just a little shot of the circuit board. You know, you got to have one of those in every talk somewhere, you know. So, this is kind of this wireless sensor system I'm building for this project. I'm actually using it on my horn tonight. But these examples kind of lead me to this longest example, which is this, maybe the one that's the kind of, could almost stand as a complete study. And I'm kind of calling it, based on some of the work that Murray was doing, called Le Voile des Oiseaux, and after the book of the same name by Murray. And what you'll see actually in this example is my attempt to make the gestures visible. In this case, the bowing of the violin, and the trace itself becomes the subject of the etude. Excuse me. So on the one hand, the image looks like a readout in a sense, of the data, but here it's the gesture that allows you to see beyond into the image. And so in this sense, the gesture functions like a resist. Sort of using the word resistance in a different way, the gesture functions like a resist in the printmaking sense of the term, where it's preserving preserving the image behind that which is otherwise effaced. So this idea of actually kind of looking through something, and this is another way, a form of resistance. So in the end, I've tried to show you today with these set of examples, various pieces, how the language and presence of gesture informs every aspect of my work, especially this new project, and the resistance of the system kind of via obstinate behavior or resistance of the instrument itself, and the orchestration of gestures needed to make music with the instrument are the kind of very fabric of the compositional process. This is the thing that we do. And so in the case of studies in movement, the gesture is data, the gesture is image, and the gesture is sound. Thank you.